Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you properly.
Wonderful. I am very grateful to all of you for being here. So, good morning to my American friends and colleagues, and buonasera to my very dear colleagues and friends overseas in Rome and in Europe in general. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm also very grateful for my esteemed colleagues and co-authors, co-editors on this fascinating project because they introduce so many subjects and so many voices. And while my colleagues concentrated more on the border, which is primarily in the Americas, let's put it this way, this chapter is somewhat different. Why is it different? Because it brings us to Europe, to Italy specifically. And it would be a lie to say, well, there is this crisis that just started, because truth being said, we've had this humanitarian crisis, migration crisis, for at least a decade now. And the headlines started huge, talking to us about tragedies since at least 2013. And the Pope's first official visit outside of Vatican was specifically to the heart of human misery, to the tiny island of Lampedusa. How does it all connect to this beautiful, painful project? My colleagues addressed a very interesting problem, which is one of the most discussed problems in the field of critical cultural studies, which is the problem of speaking for others, the problem of representing others. Very often we see those images, we read those headlines, and we rarely have this unique chance to actually learn with and from people who are mostly affected. That is why this chapter of the book is very different, not only geopolitically, if you wish, but also in its method. And this chapter wouldn't be possible without my absolutely amazing collaborator, co-author on this, and also a close friend of mine, Dr. Veronica De Sanctis. So I would like to tell you about things we did and our findings. But before that, I would like Veronica to tell you about the most important part of this book, people we had the privilege of interviewing. Veronica, I will let you speak on our behalf about people who were kind enough to share their painful and hopeful stories, and how we even collected the data. I will gladly present to wider audience.
Thank you, Julia. Just a little bit of introduction for our audience to understand better the result of the research. It's very, very challenging, and it's a very sensitive issue to collect data about the single story of the people. We have talking already about in the past of people, not numbers, but when it comes to talk to people, there are emotions, there is sensitivities, and it is very challenging to lead a research that has people and not numbers. And our research has made be possible thanks also to the Scalabrinian Fathers, because our case study is Casa Scalabrini 634. Casa Scalabrini 634 is the mission of the Scalabrinian Agency for Cooperation and Development, and it's a mission here based in Rome, where they host migrants and families, helping them integrating in semi-autonomy in the Italian culture, in Italian society, I would say. And Casa Scalabrini started in 2015 when the outbreak of migration studies raised here in, migration issues raised here in Europe. And following the message of Pope Francis, Scalabrinians opened their door here in Rome and welcome. They did what they could to welcome, promote, and integrate migrant people. And so, trying not to be intrusive, too intrusive, we had the privilege to interview very few people that accepted to be interviewed, because some of them were not willing to be interviewed. Others just didn't want to live again that feeling, although we made everything possible to avoid any recall of traumas in our survey and in our questions. But anyway, in the end, we had a few number of African people from Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Gambia, and Asian people, specifically from Pakistan and Tibet, that were current at that time, as well as former guests of Casa Scalabrini. And for the results of the data we collected, Giulia can tell more about how we decided to share their stories. Thank you, Giulia.
Grazie, Cara. Thank you very much. So yes, we had this huge questionnaire with a line of questions, semi-structured and open-ended, because we truly didn't know what we were looking for, and we also didn't want to put any frames. We asked people about their past experiences, about those so-called push-pull factors, what made them leave their beloved homeland, what expectations they had and what challenges they faced, what future they envision. And then we try to see if there are any similarities in our findings. And these are our findings. So number one thing we discovered about in terms of similarities is how all of those people talked about their past, and their past could be best characterized with kind of this love-hate relationship with their memory. A lot of haunted memories, a lot of homesickness and nostalgia, because a lot of families were torn and left behind. Many people left for economic opportunities. Many people left because of political or religious persecution. We also included some quotes here, and also we were very respectful of the privacy and vulnerability of our interviewees. So here you will only see the cultures/countries they represent, and even in the actual chapter, the names are not their real names, because that was a very vulnerable thing to do. So, for example, we see the military killed many people. The military entered various neighborhoods to arrest some movement leaders. We have a story, for example, about a group of young people, and our interviewee is in his late 20s and trying to rebel against the very corrupt government, and just seeing that it's not leading anywhere, and also experiencing his friends and kind of passionate peers dying in front of his eyes, and his own mom telling him to leave if you want to live, and very tormented stories. So we hear stories like this. Or, for example, this story comes from Tibet, and this story is less about police brutalities, but more of a absolute cultural domination. Here we have, in many places, Tibetan schools have been closed, and in their place there are now Chinese schools. Tibetan language and culture are increasingly marginalized. We call this phenomenon also linguicide, when your native tongue needs to be silenced and is purposefully erased. We experience this here in the United States with a lot of native nations, right? But it's not, it's a universal phenomenon typical of dominant cultures. So here we see that too, and people who are trying to preserve their language, their tradition, their religion, their culture, they also are very often forced to leave. So, and it brings us to this idea of diasporic existence, that where you have this memory of home, you need to combine it with constant, fluid self-reflexivity. What does it mean? You constantly ask yourself, who am I? Because there is the old I part of that home culture, but there is this new I in a new cultural context, which in our case was in Italy, which brought us to the second stage, La vita italiana, or Italian life, oggi, today. So what were the biggest challenges our participants, regardless of their countries of origin, their age, their gender, because we had a wide range in that, faced? And there were three dominant themes. Number one is probably the most predictable: language barrier, because if our if our interviewees had any knowledge of foreign language, that would be primarily English, in some cases French, depending on where they would come from, right? But Italian is a very different game. So whatever happened, so it was also a very interesting process for us, because you have to think that our data is at least trilingual, because it is thought in native tongues, communicated to Veronica in some kind of Italian, with her trying to understand what exactly that means. Then she would send it to me. Then it's translated from Italian into English, also with certain modifications to make sense of all that pain translated into words. So language barrier was among them. The social demotion was a huge one as well. What does it mean? Unfortunately, to also borrow from Aditya's concept of the single story, migrants very often become this kind of one single story of poverty, needy migrants who are in use of food and shelter and protection, integration, jobs, home, hope, all of that. And our participants would tell us heartbreaking stories about who they used to be, doctors and lawyers and nurses, except none of that matters because their diplomas have no validity. There is this huge barrier. They don't even have a permit to work very often. So that becomes kind of a separate chapter. The old me that had a beautiful job, aspirations, future, and the new me who is just seen as a needy migrant, which is again and again kind of the problem of representation. And the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle that was repeated again and again is racism, and in different forms, and especially racism, not just on the institutional level, but primarily in the practices of everyday life. Very often people would go back to interactions they experienced in public transportation, because that's where a lot of interaction happened. So I have two quotes for you here. On the bus, people get up if you sit down. They would not sit down next to you. I felt offended because someone also told me to get back home. It got worse when people would say, well, you don't smell well, leave, go home. And we have a nurse from Senegal in her 30s being being very open about it, and we left a lot out, but these are kind of, you can sense what is going on there. Another one was once on the bus, and this is a 19-year-old participant. Two elderly people accused me of not paying for the ticket just because I'm African. I replied in Italian because I learned it well, and I also showed them the season ticket. There were some Italian boys who called me brother and welcomed me among them. So we also have stories like this. And the third one comes from our interviewee from Tibet, who also told us on multiple occasions that he was kind of racially profiled as the Chinese other, because it's another single story of Far East Asia. And that particular discrimination also had to do with the specific moment in time with the coronavirus, right? And here we see I'm often mistaken for a Chinese and therefore blamed for the spread of the virus. They treated me badly in clothing stores, saying not to touch anything. Don't even mention food, because you couldn't even be close to anything, because like any food items, because the reaction was even stronger. You brought the virus here and people wouldn't even care where you're actually from. So we see that. And we also talked, so what how do you handle all this? How do you move forward? And would say, well, we all eventually need to embrace our new Italian life, and it means embrace it linguistically, socially, culturally, psychologically. And they also mentioned that they don't feel quite alone, because there are quite a few organizations that help them integrate. And one of them, in case in point, is Casa Scalabrini, and where we have all kinds of courses, language integration courses, culture, community building, volunteer opportunities. So things exist, but it's complicated. And that's why our next question was, what about tomorrow? What do you see yourself? Where is all of this going? Where do you see yourself building your community? And how do you negotiate between those two identities, the old and the emerging hybrid new? And our main kind of finding, if you wish, was that there is no universal formula of integration success in Italy or European Union or anywhere in the world. And we had very diverse responses. For example, some preferred so-called cultural chameleonism or assimilation. Some preferred to build their little bubbles. For example, our Pakistani interviewee said, I try to create a culture within a culture every time. So I know many Italians, but I mostly surround myself with Pakistanis. We have shared food, we have shared space, we have shared language. We just try to recreate those pockets of culture, if you wish. And we asked about identity and effects it had on identity building. They said, well, my identity hasn't really changed. It's just I gained additional one, kind of this Italian one. We also noticed that some other participants were of a different opinion. It was more about mingling with the other and trying to do this culture and linguistic exchange. And another finding that was also pretty repetitive was feeling of safety. And that was on the positive note, saying like, I feel much more confident about everything after some time. I learned a lot about Italian culture, language, and I feel much safer. Also mentioning that human rights just have different validity in different spaces. Even beloved homes can be not the best places for the protection of human rights. So that was very powerful for us. So where does it bring us? It brings us to our encouragement with this volume, not to speak for others, but rather engage in meaningful dialogues and interactions with the other. And that's why this beautiful, beautiful book, here it is, one more time, we're very, very proud of it, because this book explores the process of constructing a home place. And this is not just the story about the other, these are collective voices of migrants, of refugees, showing us, teaching us, sharing with us how they negotiate their identities, how they adopt their communication, and how they build communities. Because it turns out one can build communities in many different ways. It can be physical, but it also can be virtual, as my esteemed colleague showed, how they show resistance, how they tell stories, how they engage in activism. And once again, activism can be physical, but it also can be done on social media. How people can challenge existing structures and build something new.
Thank you, Julia. You have a few more seconds if you wish to.
Wonderful. That's why I'm bringing you to my very last slide, because probably you're asking, what do those images have in common? And they have in common a thought for all of you to take away, that all of us are actually somehow migrants. And I'm giving you two beautiful statues that say it better than 1,000 words. One of these, Angels Unaware, and you can recognize it in 2019. It appeared in Piazza San Pietro in Vatican, and it depicts 140 migrants and refugees from different historical periods traveling on boat, and they include people like Virgin Mary and Joseph, and Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, and other people and representative of tormented places, right? And interesting thing is, Pope specifically asked for that statue after he saw the one on the bottom, which is called Homeless Jesus. So if that doesn't inspire you to think about all of us somehow related to this and somehow in this together, I don't know what does. Thank you very much. And once again, Veronica, thank you for making all of this happen. Thank you for organizing this beautiful and important event and being my amazing co-author.
Thank you. We are very happy. And your reference to Pope Francis just lead us to the next speaker, who's a Scalabrinian, Father Pat Murphy, currently in his 8 years as director of the Casa del Migrante in Tijuana. It's a house for migrants and refugees in Tijuana. And so he will talk about church migration and the role of faith-based organization. Thank you